Let's go ahead and get started this morning. Happy Mother's Day. Thank you, Derek. Thank you all for being here this morning. A lot of times when I say I have a lot of material, sometimes it is a lot. I said that last week, and we finished class in 35 minutes. So you never really can tell, but I think I have a lot today, so we better get started. My intention this morning is to get through all of Matthew chapter 23, not because I'm necessarily rushing through it, although I would like to get this study done sooner or later. We're in lesson 39 this morning. But because the chapter kind of flows together pretty well, and so I think this is a chapter where it's appropriate to not necessarily look at each nuance of each word, but we can kind of look at the big picture of what's going on. And so keeping in mind where we've been most recently in Matthew's gospel account, Jesus entered Jerusalem at the beginning of chapter 21. That's, if you recall, the triumphal entry, rides in on the donkey and the colt, and so on and so forth. And since that entrance into Jerusalem, what we've seen Jesus doing is speaking, I would say strongly, against the Jewish leaders. And here are a few examples of this. You have the demonstration in the temple where he overturns the table of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling birds. Then you have the triad of parables starting in chapter 21 into chapter 22. This is the parable of the two sons, the parable of the tenants, and then the parable of the wedding feast. Each of those offer a pretty strong indictment against the Jewish leaders, and Jesus gets them to admit it as he's telling them those parables. And then last week we looked at some of these interactions in the end of chapter 22, like they ask Jesus about paying taxes to Caesar. They ask Jesus about the resurrection the Sadducees do. They ask him about something they don't even believe in, so you can kind of see the absurdity in that. And then a lawyer asks Jesus about the Great Commandment, and so on and so forth. And so there's been this series of interactions, and what we've seen since Jesus has been in Jerusalem, he's been speaking against the Jewish leaders. And what we see here in Matthew chapter 23 is the climax of this. Matthew 23 serves as the climax of the indictment against the Jewish leaders. This is commonly referred to as the seven woes. Some of your versions might have 8 of them, because in my version, verse 14 is omitted. I say my version, I didn't make it. It's the ESV. That's what I'm reading from. Some versions may have a verse 14, others may not. But if you have a verse 14, that would be the 8th one. That would actually be the second one, but then there's 7 more after that, or 6 more. And so this is commonly referred to as the 7 woes of the scribes and Pharisees. And so in most versions, there's 7 of them. But interestingly, those woes are addressed to the scribes and Pharisees, but there's also some moments where Jesus addresses the crowd and his disciples. And that's actually the first thing we see Jesus do when you look at the beginning of the chapter, is he addresses the crowd and his disciples in the first 12 verses, which we'll look at in a moment. Before we start reading, one more point I want to make. As Jesus' earthly ministry is beginning to reach its end, we're inching our way to the climax where they kill Jesus. This chapter strongly foreshadows the end of Jesus' ministry, which is, of course, his death. And so what we see happening here is he's speaking very strongly against the very ones who are going to arrest him and eventually will turn him over to the Romans to be crucified. And what we see happening here is the things that Jesus says about them, they will inevitably prove what he says to be right as they carry out these actions, which we'll see starting in chapter 26, when he is arrested and then eventually led to be crucified. So with all of that in mind, we'll begin by looking at Jesus addressing the crowd and his disciples. Before we get to the 7 woes, there's this initial interaction starting in verse 1 through verse 12. It says, "Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, 'The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach, but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others. For they make their phylacteries, I think is how you pronounce that, broad, and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts, and the best seats in the synagogues, and greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. So this is the initial interaction that Jesus has before he addresses the scribes and Pharisees. And interestingly, he's not talking to them here, but he is talking about them. This is the subject of what he says to the crowds and to his disciples. It's about the scribes and the Pharisees. He mentions them specifically in verse 2. And so what you see happening here in this initial interaction in these first 12 verses is Jesus is creating this sort of juxtaposition where you have two things and you can weigh them against each other. And so on the one hand, you have the hypocrisy that he's going to mention and that you'll see of the Jewish leaders. And then you have, on the other hand, the expected behavior of his disciples. He begins by talking about the Jewish leaders and their hypocrisy. Then he ties in what he expects of his followers after that. So first we see how Jesus portrays the scribes and the Pharisees. And he portrays them as hypocrites. And what's interesting is as you go through the woes that follow, in all but one of them, I think, he calls them hypocrites. Except for, I believe, the third one, where he calls them blind guides instead. And so he is pointing out the hypocrisy of the scribes and Pharisees before he specifically addresses them as hypocrites, at least 6 times. And so he mentions in verse 2 that they sit on Moses' seat. There's debate as to what he specifically means when he talks about sitting on Moses' seat. Some speculate that there's actually a seat over time that, I don't know if Moses would have sat on it per se, but something that perhaps was representative of Moses where he would have sat as he was receiving the law. I don't see a lot of evidence for that. It seems more so that they're using this in a metaphorical sense. To say that they sit at Moses' seat is to say they're teaching what Moses taught. That language is used in rabbinic circles pretty frequently, and so that's what it seems they're talking about. And so because they are sitting on Moses' seat, because they're teaching what Moses taught, Jesus says that they should do and observe whatever they say to do, but don't do as they do. And the reason for that is, of course, because they preach, but they do not practice. Have your parents ever said to you, do as I say, not as I do? Have you as a parent ever said that to your children? This seems to be what Jesus is getting at here in terms of the scribes and Pharisees. Do as they say, but not as they do. And it's interesting because previously Jesus warned his disciples about the teaching of the Pharisees. He warned them against the leaven, right, of the scribes and Pharisees. I forget what chapter that's in, but that's something that he warned them of previously. I want to say chapter 15, but I could be wrong. So on the one hand, he warns them against their teaching. Now he says for them to follow their teaching. What we see previously is that teaching is not just their teaching, but it's the way that they carry themselves as well in a hypocritical manner. And so they taught the right things, they just didn't apply it in the right ways when it came to their own personal lives. As Jesus says, they preach, but they do not practice. And so that is, as we would call, a hypocrite, where you say one thing and then you do something else. The word hypocrite literally refers to someone who's a two-faced person. And it stems from ancient theater where you didn't have all these different actors lying around, and so you'd have one or two people play all the parts, and they would just change faces. That's the root word of the word hypocrite, as I understand it. And so they are hypocrites. They're saying one thing, they're teaching one thing, but then they're doing something different. And what we see happening here is they are giving people heavy burdens to bear, and yet, as Jesus says, they lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. moving with your finger is pretty minimal effort. And they're not willing to even put that in. And so they give the people these heavy burdens to bear. You may recall in Acts when the issue of circumcision comes up in chapter 15. And what is it that it said? This is a burden that not even our fathers could bear. And so you see similar language used here. There's these heavy burdens that are given, and yet the scribes and Pharisees won't even move an inch. They won't move even a finger in regards to that. And there's a big contrast here if you are following Matthew's gospel with what Jesus says in chapter 11 in verses 28 and 30, where he says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." The burden of Christ is light. Contrast that with the burden of the scribes and Pharisees. And here Jesus says it's a heavy burden, and it's hard to bear. So you see a pretty big contrast here. Another contrast, they do all their deeds to be seen by others. You may recall what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. I'll read there just briefly for a moment, when he talks about them needing to be careful about doing their good deeds in order to be seen by other people. He doesn't say don't do good deeds, because we can do good things and bring glory to God. That's what he says in Matthew 5 when he says to let your light shine before others. But then in chapter 6 and verse 1 he says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them." And he goes on through examples like giving to the needy, praying, and fasting. And what we see is these Jewish leaders, these scribes and Pharisees, they're doing exactly what Jesus warned us to not do in the Sermon on the Mount. They do all of their deeds in order to be seen by others. And what did Jesus say in the Sermon on the Mount? They'll receive their reward. What is it that they're after? They're after being glorified by men. They'll receive that, but they won't receive anything more. And so they do their good deeds to be seen by others. And this summarizes the rest of what Jesus says through the first 8 verses. He talks about they make their phylacteries broad, their fringes long. The fringes of their garment, if they were longer, that usually meant they were of a more prominent status, as I understand it. I'll have a picture of what a phylactery is in a moment. That's something they wore on their head or on their arm, as I understand it, but mostly on the heads. And it says in verse 6, they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces. In other words, they love to be in a prominent position, whether that's at the head of the table or the one that was greeted in the marketplaces or what have you. They liked being and feeling important. And they especially liked being called rabbi by others, as it says at the end of verse 7. So they liked having these fancy titles. They liked being greeted. They liked everything that comes with being a person of prominent status. And so they liked doing things in order to be seen by others. And included in that is this phylactery. This is what a phylactery is. It's this little box that's on this person's head. And the basis of this was a little box, and it had the words of the law, some words of the law. I don't recall the specific ones. It might be the Shema from Deuteronomy 6, but because that's the specific words that it says here in this context. But they had words there in that box. And when it says there, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be frontlets between your eyes, they took that literally. And so they would wear these things on their hands, and they would wear it between their eyes. And this is a modern picture. And so this still even happens today. And this is something that they would do. And what they would do is, Jesus says, they made their phylacteries broad. In other words, they had either bigger boxes or perhaps bigger straps on their heads. And the purpose of that is, of course, to draw attention to themselves. That's why they do that. So that's what he says about the scribes and the Pharisees. Then he makes the contrast with what is expected of his disciples. And all of what he says can be summarized in the fact that their identity comes from their teacher, from their father, and from their instructor. They have one teacher, they have one Father in heaven, they have one instructor. That one is the basis of all of the rest of what he expects of them. And so in verse 8 he says, "You're not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you're all brothers." Because we have that one rabbi, because we have that one Father in heaven, we're all brothers. And brothers and sisters. I think the word he uses is the gender-neutral term. And so instead of wearing pious titles, like being called rabbi, or thinking in modern religious context, even in supposed Christian context, not using titles such as pastor or father or reverend, we don't use titles like that. That's what the Jewish leaders did. They loved to be called rabbi, but we don't wear those titles. Instead, we're fellow brothers, and we're also to be considered servants. And so he goes on to say, "The greatest among you shall be your servant." And this ties in with what we've already seen Jesus draw out in Matthew's gospel account. If you want to be great, you need to be a servant. That's how it is in God's kingdom. It's a reversal of what you might typically expect. And this little section ends in verse 12 with Jesus saying, "Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." This is a teaching that's echoed throughout a lot of the New Testament. You can think of what James says, for example, in James chapter 4. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you, right? That sort of thing. This is really the kingdom in and of itself. And this ties in with what Jesus has said, where he says the last will be first and the first last. This is the same principle. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. And now what's about to happen as we get into the 7 woes, Jesus is going to humble the ones who have exalted themselves. This is a humbling that Jesus does to them. And so before we get into it, let me briefly mention a few things. This is where he issues the 7 or 8, depending on your version, woes in verses 13 through 36. A woe is the opposite of a blessing. The Greek word that's translated as woe, it literally means to denote pain or displeasure. So you might hear someone say, "Oh, woe is me." That's someone who's throwing a pity party, right? Someone who is feeling down on themselves. Well, if you're giving a woe to someone else, that means that you're expressing displeasure or pain at that person. And again, this is the opposite of a blessing. And you could contrast what he says here with the blessings of the kingdom that he issues in Matthew chapter 5, the Beatitudes. Remember, when we looked at that in Matthew 5, that word blessed, it literally means to be happy. Happy are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom in heaven, so on and so forth. That's what that word makarioi, I think, is the Greek word that means blessed. That's what that literally means. And a woe is the opposite of that. And so if a blessing is a reason to be happy, a woe would be a reason to not be happy, to be upset, or to have displeasure, as is implied in the Greek word. There's something interesting, and I don't know if it's intentional on Jesus' part, but it's interesting to notice. The first 6 woes you can kind of pair together, 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6. Some have even argued for a chiastic mirrored structure with these. I don't see that necessarily as much as I see in these pairings. And they seem to be related. Certainly 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 are related. Woe number 1 and number 2 pertain to the Jewish leaders leading others astray. We'll get into that in more detail as we go through them. Woe 3 and woe 4 pertain to selectively following the law. 5 and 6 is what I meant, actually, instead of 3 and 4. 1 and 2 and 5 and 6 are certainly pairings. Woe 5 and 6 pertain to outward piety. You have first the mention of cleaning the outside of the cup, neglecting the inside, and then you have the mention in woe number 6 of the whitewashed tombs. So you see these groupings that seem at least to have some things in common. Leading others astray is the first coupling. Selectively following the law would be the second coupling. That might be a bit of a stretch, but there is a little bit of a connection there. And then the outward piety is certainly a connection with woe number 5 and number 6. And if you follow that structure, that leaves you with the 7th one that's left. And this serves as the climax of these 7 woes. And the reason that this is the climax is because this woe has with it the charge of murder. What he'll go on to say is, your fathers killed the prophets. You've self-admittedly placed your ancestorship to these very ones who killed the prophets, and you're going to do just as they did, except they are going to kill the Christ. So with that, let's look at the first woe in verse 13. It says, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. For you neither enter yourselves, nor allow those who would enter to go in." So what we see Jesus accusing them of here is they are shutting the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. The image I think of personally is someone slamming a door shut so that no one can get in. That's what I think of. CJ just demonstrated it. When I was in college, in the freshman dorm, they had, on the 3rd floor where all my buddies lived, they had a door slamming contest one time. And my buddies literally broke the door frame. They cracked it because they slammed their door so hard. The next semester we came back and they had those little door stoppers up at the top, those spring-loaded ones. We couldn't slam our doors anymore. So that's the image I think of in regards to this, is them slamming the door shut for people to be able to enter the kingdom. They shut it in people's faces, is what Jesus says. And so what we see in this is not only are they not going to enter because of their own hypocrisy and their own wickedness, but because they're teaching that to other people, they are preventing others from doing so as well. And it reminds me of the words of James, who we believe to be the brother of Christ, when in James chapter 3 and verse 1, interestingly, I just did a sermon from this text and I neglected to give much commentary on verse 1. It was more about the power of the tongue. But in James 3 and verse 1, he says, "Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know how that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness." Teachers are judged with greater strictness. And to a degree, we're all called to be teachers, whether we're teaching others in a public way, like perhaps right now, or in an interpersonal setting, perhaps around the family dinner table, what have you. We're all called to teach in some capacity. But teachers are going to be judged more harshly. And this is what we see happening with them, because not only are they themselves in this folly and their hypocrisy, but they're leading others into that as well. And connected with that is the second woe in verse 15. You may notice there's not a verse 14, or at least not in the translation I'm reading from. That's a manuscript thing, not anything besides that. That's not a conspiracy of people taking verses out of the King James. It's not like that. So in verse 15, it says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves." Some versions, instead of hell, may use the word Gehenna. So what we see with this woe, they go to great lengths in order to make a proselyte. And in some ways, perhaps that's admirable, that they're putting in all of this effort to make a convert, because that's what a proselyte is. It's a Gentile who becomes a Jew, is I think the literal kind of idea in that. Someone who converts to Judaism is the idea behind that. And yet, what are they converting them to? They're converting them to something that is not true, to their own sort of hypocritical twist on Judaism. And so they're leading people astray. And so as what we saw in verse 13, in converting others to their own hypocrisy, they are shutting the kingdom in their faces. And so they are leading people astray. And they're putting in all of this effort just to lead people really to their spiritual demise. And it can't help but think they could have taken that effort and put it toward something better. So you can kind of see how those two go together. They both have with it the idea of leading people astray, which is what they were doing. Then you have kind of related to that the third woe, which we'll read. It's a little longer in verses 16 through 22. It says, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing, but if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he's bound by his oath. You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that has made the gold sacred? And you say, if anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing, but if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, he is bound by his oath. You blind men, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it." The reason why I say this is somewhat connected to the second woe is because Jesus addresses them as blind guides. That's kind of what we see them doing in the first two woes, the blind leading the blind. Interestingly, this is the only woe where Jesus does not address them as hypocrites. Instead, he addresses them as blind guides. The blind, I would imagine, I've never been guided by a blind person before, but I would imagine they would be pretty sorry guides. And this is kind of an image to kind of depict what that would be like. If you have a blind person leading other blind people, it's just a recipe for disaster. And this, in a spiritual sense, is what the Jews were doing, except their blindness was more willing than perhaps the others. What we see that they have become blinded by is presumably greed. That's kind of the underlying issue that you see here in this particular woe, in the fact that they don't care if you swear an oath by the temple, but they do care if you swear an oath by the gold of the temple. And the same for the altar. They don't care if you swear by the altar, but if you swear an oath by the gift that's on the altar, you better well make sure that you're keeping that oath. And keep in mind, Jesus has already said you shouldn't have to make oaths, right? That's something that he's already said previously. He's brought it up actually a couple times, I think. Once in the Sermon on the Mount, let your yes be yes and your no, no, that sort of thing. And so they're more concerned, these Jews are, the leaders, about the gold of the temple than they are the temple itself. And that's precisely the problem. They're more concerned about the gift that's on the altar rather than the altar itself, which is obviously where you go and you make sacrifices. Perhaps this is why this chapter will end with Jesus saying to Jerusalem, he addresses the city of Jerusalem specifically, "Your house is left desolate." Perhaps this is part of the reason why. It's because they care more about the gold in the temple than the temple itself. And this is ironic because it's the temple that makes that gold so sacred. And without the altar, that gift more or less is meaningless in the spiritual sense. And so you see again the continued irony that we see pertaining to how the Jewish leaders are shaping out. It's ironic because they value that gold much more than the temple. Because of that, the temple is going to be desolate. And the next chapter, Jesus is going to foretell the destruction of the temple. Next, we have the fourth woe in verses 23 and 24. And again, this sort of couples with the third one. It says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel." And so here again, you see the hypocrisy in the sense that they are caring more about certain laws than they are other ones. And the laws they care more about are the tithing laws. Hey, you better make sure that you're giving your tithe, even if it's something simple like mint or dill or cumin. And what Jesus says here is they are neglecting the weightier matters of the law. This shows us, on the one hand, there are some aspects of the law that are more important than other ones. Jesus shows us that here. And what we see is they have neglected the weightier matters. And here Jesus actually names some of them. I don't know if this is a comprehensive list necessarily. You could perhaps make the case that it is, that everything would encapsulate these. But specifically, Jesus mentions that they were neglecting justice, they were neglecting mercy, and they were neglecting faithfulness. these are the things they're neglecting while putting all their emphasis on tithing cumin and dill and so on and so forth. And so what you see here, the priorities are way out of whack. Just as with the previous one, they cared more about the temple, or they cared more about the gold than the temple itself. They cared more about the gift than the altar itself. You see a misalignment of priorities, and it seems, again, greed would be the motivation for this in particular. And he gives this image to illustrate the point of their misalignment of their priorities. They are straining out a gnat, something very small. It's that time of year the gnats are going to start showing up, if they haven't already. And yet, they're swallowing a camel. Reminds me a little bit of what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, you worry about the speck in your brother's eye when you have a plank in your own eye. This is that same imagery, except it's more intensified, because a camel's a lot bigger than a plank, I would imagine. And a gnat's a little smaller, maybe about the same size as a speck that would be in your eye. And although this image is rather absurd, it is certainly fitting, because this shows you where their priorities were. And here's an image to kind of illustrate the point. One's got a gnat in his food, the other has a camel. And the one with the camel is pointing out the gnat in the other guy's food. That would be like if you look and your buddy has a fly in his food and you have a big used Band-Aid in yours, and you're pointing out the fly in his. You're ignoring that Band-Aid. You better get that Band-Aid out of there too. Huh? Oh, CJ eats Band-Aids. He just admitted that. If you have any Band-Aids, CJ will take them. No, I'm kidding. You got to be careful, CJ. Don't give me more ammunition than I already have. Next we come to the fifth woe, which is in verses 25 and 26. And again, woe number 5 and number 6 are coupled together, and this is the first one. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, that the outside also may be clean." Have you ever known someone who does dishes and they just wash the outside and they neglect the inside? That's obviously gross, right? If you don't clean the inside of the cup, you haven't really cleaned it. This is what Jesus is getting at here. They cared more about the outside of the cup being clean than they did the inside. And I don't think he's being literal here. It's not like they're there doing dishes and so on. This is speaking instead of their devotion to the outward appearance instead of the inward righteousness that they should be focused on. Instead of inward holiness, they're focused on looking good on the outside. And this ties in with what he said previously when he said in verse 5, they do all their deeds to be seen by others. Then he goes through some of the specific examples. And so instead of focusing on their actual behavior in their hearts, they care more about how they're perceived by other people. And so they put on a show on the outside, but inwardly it is unclean. And as Jesus says, it's full of greed and self-indulgence. Those two characteristics kind of summarize what Jesus is drawing out about the scribes and Pharisees in this chapter. Greed and self-indulgence. They want to look good before other people. So that's woe number 5. Woe number 6 is very similar, except the language is actually a little more intense. So starting in verse 27, it says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." The image of a whitewashed tomb is a really good image to convey what Jesus is talking about here. And how I think of it, think of a tomb, it'd be almost like a cave that's kind of sealed. So think maybe like a wall. And Paul actually uses this imagery in the book of Acts. He calls them a whitewashed wall there in that particular instance. It's clean on the outside. Maybe I don't know if they didn't have power washers back then. But imagine you take a power washer and you clean a wall or you clean a tomb. It looks really good, right? But they don't clean the inside. And so if you have a whitewashed tomb, the outside could look really nice, but the inside is still a tomb. And if there's a body in there, then inside of that tomb is still death and all uncleanness on the inside. This is a particularly strong image for Jesus to use, in part because of the Mosaic law. You couldn't touch a dead body. You'd be unclean. So for him to describe them as a tomb that has a dead body on the inside, that's pretty strong. And so on the outside it's clean, but on the inside, in Jesus' words, it has all uncleanness in it. And in particular, he mentions their hypocrisy and their lawlessness. Outwardly, they put on a good show. They were the ones who would go in the streets and in their prayers, they would babble like pagans, as Jesus says in Matthew 6. Jesus says for us to not be like that in our prayers, because that draws attention to ourselves. This is what they were wanting to do. They looked outwardly pious, but on the inside, it's just some bones. So you can kind of see how Woe 5 and Woe 6 pair together. They portray an outward cleanness, but really it reflects an inside uncleanness. And that brings us to the climax of these woes with woe number 7. And this again is a little lengthy, and there's debate as to where you cut this off, but I'll just include through the rest of this before he addresses Jerusalem in verse 37. So it says, starting in verse 29, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, If we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." This is the climax of the woes, and you can see why. He begins by pointing out how they acted, in the sense that they acted like they were different than those who were before them. He mentions that they build tombs, they build up the tombs of the prophets, and they decorate the monuments of the righteous. They're acting like if it had been them, they wouldn't have killed these prophets and these righteous people. They're acting like they're different than their fathers. But Jesus points out the irony in this, because as he says in verse 31, you witness against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. They would claim that they're sons of Abraham. He says, no, your sons are the ones who killed the prophets. This is your lineage, not that of Abraham, but it's that of these murderous people. And ironically, in saying, oh, we're not going to do like our fathers did, they're placing claim to that heritage. And so it's ironic that they do that. And what Jesus ends up telling them, he says, fill up then the measure of your fathers. And so despite what they might say and what they might do in decorating the tombs and the monuments and all of that, Jesus points out that they're going to live up to their father's reputation. And in fact, they're actually going to exceed it, because not only do they kill a prophet, they're killing the Son of God, or they will kill the Son of God. They will soon orchestrate Jesus' death among others, because it's not just Jesus they kill. Think of Saul of Tarsus before he becomes a Christian. How many Christians did he have killed, right? You see the example of Stephen in Acts 7. There are perhaps others that are not recorded in the Bible. They're soon going to orchestrate Jesus' death. And although they're not the ones who are going to drive the nails through his hands and his feet, that's the Romans. They're the ones who orchestrate it, which is why in Acts 2, Peter says, you killed Jesus. They weren't the ones who actually drove the nails in, but they were the ones who oversaw it. It's like if I hired a hitman, they would charge me, wouldn't they, along with the hitman? Same thing. And what Jesus says, the blood of all of these, not just his blood and not just the blood of the ones they'll specifically kill, but even as far back as the blood of righteous Abel and the blood of Zechariah, who they killed, their blood will be on their hands as well. This is a very strong indictment. It's a very strong image that Jesus is portraying here. That is the end of the woes. And now Jesus addresses the city of Jerusalem, starting in verse 37. So you see the strong indictment that Jesus has given, climaxing with that seventh woe, accusing them of murder, which they will eventually, of course, do. And starting in verse 37, it says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" So now, at the end of this, Jesus addresses the city of Jerusalem. First, what he does, he acknowledges the reputation that that city has. Keep in mind, to the Jews, Jerusalem is the holy city. But here Jesus calls it the city that kills the prophets and stones those who were sent to it. This ties in with how they thought of themselves. They think of themselves as pious. Jerusalem was thought of as the holy city of God. That's where God was, in the temple. Here Jesus says, you're the city that kills the prophets and stones those who were sent to it. So that's the first thing he says. Then he offers a lament. And he laments over the fact that they are not willing to let Jesus gather them. They're going to reject Jesus. They're going to kill Jesus. He's lamenting over the fact that he could have gathered them as a hen gathers her chicks, but they won't let him. He says, you were not willing. So this is a rejection of the Son of God. Then Jesus says, your house is left to you desolate. He seems to be talking about the temple. And what you see happening here is a little bit perhaps of some foreshadowing to chapter 24, the next unit, the beginning of what's commonly called the Olivet Discourse. The scene shifts to the Mount of Olives, starting in verse 3 of that chapter. And he's going to talk about the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. So perhaps there's some foreshadowing there. And finally, Jesus explains why it's desolate. You could point out specific things they've done, but here's why it's desolate. It's because Jesus is leaving. He's leaving it and he's not coming back to it. He says, your house is left to you desolate, for, in verse 39, that indicates this is the reason why, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So their house is left desolate, and eventually it will be destroyed, pertaining to the temple. Any comments or questions? CJ?
Yeah, this is what happened the first time, right? The glory of the Lord left the first temple, and then what happened? The Babylonians came and destroyed it. Jesus says the same thing's going to happen. I'm leaving the temple, and it's going to be another destruction.
Yeah, CJ points out that this is, Yogi Berra had an expression, it's deja vu all over again. This is what's happening again. This happened with the first temple in the book of Ezekiel, and Jim did a great job in his class about the dwelling place of God, drawing this out in more detail. But in Ezekiel, we read of the glory of the Lord leaving his temple. What happens after that? Babylon comes and they destroy it. They do eventually get to rebuild it. By now, Herod has made it into a more grand sort of display. And now the same thing has happened. Jesus has left the temple. He's not coming back, and it will be destroyed. Good connection. Garfield?
I just want to mention in verse 16, it says, woe unto you, you blind guides. I just want to, verse that goes with that very well. It's in the 15th chapter of Matthew, verses 13 and 14, he says, "But he answered and said, Every plant which my heavenly Father hath not planted shall be rooted up." This is Jesus speaking. In verse 14 he says, "Let them alone. They be blind leaders of the blind, and the blind lead the blind, they shall both fall into the ditch." So he used that term blind guys before.
Yeah, Garfield points out another instance where that imagery is used of the blind leading the blind. And in that particular image, they're going to end up in a pit. All right. Thanks for your attention.